Developed nations have laid emphasis on an integrated approach to STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and the results are there to see. Science has, for example, cured disease, brought us closer together through travel and modern communication technologies, and helped us better understand and respond to environmental challenges. Just a few years ago, we assumed the challenges of smallpox and acid rain were beyond solving. They have now been largely overcome. Data is the genesis of science. Deep technology is enabling us to capture data at source, be it in other galaxies or at an individual level. From the old siloed approaches, science needs to come out of labs and exclusive mindsets into open and more involved participation of people. Learning and action must become an important change that must be enabled by technology. Scientific education must start early with a connected understanding of concepts or theories to engineering and life applications. What is lacking in our global ecosystems is that connected transportation of intellectual property from conceptualization to engineering to industrialization and commercialization in a continuum. Rigor is demanded in developing a pipeline with artifacts being authored with security and privacy, provisioning title for the rightful creators in an open ecosystem. Scientific minds must be developed early to frame questions and seek the aspirational, not just sense for opportunities or see only what is convenient. A sense of urgency is required to improve the rate of innovation and the basic threshold of sustainability because the existential threats and challenges that life faces have the potential to implode quickly if we did not do something about it. India's journey in science is still painfully slow, despite the country producing Nobel and other prize winners early. There is not enough independence between science and government, where the unimaginative understanding of science is painful both with the politicians and bureaucrats. Hari Pulakkad narrates a fascinating journey of the advancement of Indian science from the early 1920s to the modern day in the bestseller Space Life Matter that he has authored. Hari, welcome to the videocast, The Future of Work with Subbu Iyer. I want to start off by asking you about two things which now you are very famous for. One is the Space Life Matters. This is a book that is authored by Hari Pulakkad. It's available on Amazon and it traces the making of the modern science in India. And of course, there is something more significant than this, I believe, which is the Shastra magazine. And Shastra is very beautifully put together. That is produced by IIT and is edited by Hari Pulakkad. And we will talk through some of this in our conversation today. Do give us a brief as to your point of arrival to both these great works of literature.
Thank you, Subbu. So book happened as an accident. I had been thinking of writing a book. Like all journalists, every journalist worth his salt or her salt, after some time wants to write a book. But since I have been a science journalist and I have been in India most of the time, I want to write about Indian science, and it is not easy to figure out what to write. And it's sort of given that when we write about science, we write about all the latest things happening, and most of the things happening in Europe and the US. So I didn't know what to do. But I had been thinking of what had happened before I started my career. I had some interest in history. So one day an agent asked me whether I had any book idea. We were introduced by a colleague. So I said yes. So this I have been thinking of what happened before I started my career, which is in 1990, between independence and 1990. But I had no idea at that time what happened. I thought I would write a book. And so as journalists, when we don't know something, we start to want to write something about it. So that's a way of learning. So I thought I would learn and write, and I wrote a proposal, which is just a back of the envelope thing, which I did in half an hour. It went, and I did not think that he would send it to a publisher, but he did. And I did not think I would get offers. I did. I got 4 offers. I chose Hachette because they called me and we had a conversation. I told them, look, I don't know much about this. This is a vague idea and it will change, and they accepted it. So then this book evolved. But it took some time before the current format took shape. It probably took about 18 months before I decided what it is going to be. Right. Till then I was doing random interviews.
This book is a very unique format. This is a book, I believe, is of tremendous value to the Gen Z and the Gen A. Most importantly, the sacrifices of these scientists who could have been stars, who could have probably earned much more Nobel Prizes if they decided to pursue their careers in different parts of the world.
What struck me was the amount of sacrifice that was needed to do science. They were trained abroad, most of them, but they were trained abroad for their PhD. They did their undergraduate education in India. Many of them masters also. They went for their PhDs and postdoc. Even now that happens. Not a substantial number of Indian scientists do their PhDs or postdocs abroad before they come back. At that time, India had nothing. Now we have an infrastructure. You can come, you can start a lab. You cannot do that in those days. You had almost no money, and the situation was you have built beautiful institutions. If you Ramarao once told me that when he went from UDCT to NCL Pune, he to look for Venkatraman, who was supposed to be his guide. He wanted to ask him, can you take me as a PhD student? He came to the building and he was struck by the majesty of that building. He had seen anything like that. So you have such a great building, and TIFR was extraordinary, but there is no money for research. So research needs consistent funding on a regular basis. There was no mechanism. There was no DST, which now funds. There was no DBT. There are no ministries which gives money. You cannot write a research grant proposal at that time. Whatever money the institution got was given a portion and given to the researcher, which was nothing. So you have to make that sacrifice. And they knew that the problems they worked on there in the US, and they would have wanted to work on, they could not do here. So you have to make an adjustment about problems that need to be solved, but still can be solved in India, even if you stretch the definition. That wasn't easy, and many people could not make that adjustment, but some did, and those are the successes that I've written about. And what also struck me is it was also the period in which they grew up. Most of them went through the independence movement, and they had a certain pride, and they knew that India is a young nation and you need to build things here, and obviously you need to build science. That sense of nationalism, without the negative connotation of nationalism which we associate now, we lost over a period of time. But later generation did not know the struggle that there was the independence movement, and we just take it for granted. A nation just grew up just like that.
Right.
So I think that we've lost it. That is why we don't have that same incentive now as they had.
You talk about science coming of age. How do you see that coming of age in India? Whereas the rest of the world in developed nations are actually looking at science completely from a new lens now than what they did in the past. Give us a little insight about what does it mean to say science has come of age in India?
Well, the literal meaning of coming of age is becoming an adult. So we have passed through childhood, we have passed through a teenager. As a teenager, now I've become an adult around 18 years of age. So journey as an adult is not going to be easy, and it has not been easy. It took first the 50 years to pass through childhood for Indian science. Indian science was not born in 1947. It was born much earlier, so probably a century. So it is now not in good shape. So in adult life, not necessarily good, right? I mean, we have a lot of struggles. So it's not in good shape in many other countries. I mean, some of the things, the problems that we go through at the moment are the problems that other countries also face. Probably a much lesser scale because they had advanced much before us. Money is in short supply everywhere. You don't get the attention of the establishment as much as they used to, scientists used to. You had to fight hard to get a project through. Politicians do not believe in science. The public does not believe in science. And the most advanced country in the world, probably 50% of the population does not believe in science. So they don't know what to support. They do not believe in the products of science. They think the vaccine is a hoax. They think that the COVID is a hoax. They do not believe in genetically engineered plants. And lots of the things that we are able to do now, and probably should do, they don't think we should do. So there is a problem around the world, and we have a problem too. But on the other hand, because of our poverty, we still are a lower middle income country with approximately $2,000 per capita income. And what do we spend it on? Do we spend it on science? How much do we spend it on science? What is the real benefit of science? Nobody really knows. If you ask a scientist, why should we invest in science? They will say the benefit, we are creating knowledge, the benefits will come at some point. But at what point? We don't know. And how much, and if that is the case, how much do you invest without really knowing what should come? And there is no clear understanding of, there's no map thing. We cannot map directly how much we invest. If you invest a specific amount now, we'll get this return 10 years later, 20 years later. We don't know. It's actually, this nature of science creates a problem. So for politicians do not understand. And they're not supposed to understand, right? I mean, even bureaucrats do not understand. They do not have a training in science. So you have to have a leap of faith to support science. And not everybody is willing to make that leap. And it's acutely problematic in India because we are still a poor nation and developing 1 billion more people staring at a huge crisis because of climate change, water, food, degradation of our land, waste, and all sorts of things. At the back of our mind, we understand that we need science to do this. But what science? Do we support theoretical physics? Do we support mathematics? Do we support astronomy? Do we spend 1,000 crores on a telescope in an international project? Do we support a Large Hadron Collider, a $100 billion project? Do we spend, out of that 100 billion, do we spend, not 100 billion, sorry, it's the radius of maybe $10 billion. Do we put in $1 billion for that? What benefit do we get? Not well understood. And it's not easy to understand. So there is a disconnect, right?
Let's stick on that disconnect for a moment. We have our societies transforming. The pace of transformation is much more than the period that your book traces, for example. And yet the narrative has not changed. We have academicians, we have researchers still talking about we do basic science and it will take time. So they are not able to transform their modes of working. You see, it was okay to say that basic science will take time in an era when we did not have the capability to do a 24/7, 365 data computing. In fact, your classic example of how the telescope data needed to be processed, and it took humongous amount of time and effort and workforce to do that. Today, you can do the same thing perhaps in a few minutes. So we have technology. The fundamental problem that I see is the inability of our ecosystem. We don't have an ecosystem. And if there was one, then it would still fail because we don't have a stage-gated process. Is it available in other developed countries? The answer is not in a formative manner, but they have followed this format, which is why a Stanford, a Harvard is able to attract endowments, is able to attract investments from philanthropists, from industries, from foundations, which our Indian institutions are not able to.
Okay, so part of this is cultural. We tend to look down upon physical work. The story is not in the book, but Govind Swarup, when he went to Australia, and they built a telescope, he had to dig. You have to do physical work, and he could not do because he had never done. And his friend Patsarthi also had not done. And the professor made fun of them. You Indians don't do any work, because we thought physical labor was not a good thing to do for the elite. We can say upper caste who did not do. This sort of mentality still exists. It's not quite physical work, but we still have gradations. Or this is fundamental research is the most important thing. The brightest brains do fundamental research, and the applications are not meant for us. Somebody else will take. Once we discover, somebody else will take this and do something useful. In fact, I do remember a conversation with the director of a large laboratory in the mid-90s who had discovered something which could be of use, but he did nothing to promote it himself. So I asked him, why don't you do something to see if this will work? It was a sort of a drug delivery mechanism. So he said, why should I do it? It's my job to discover. If somebody else wants to develop it, they should come and do it. This attitude has changed now. And now scientists do try. Some of them try to set up startups on their own. But even then, I think that they are still a minority. A small number of people do, a large number of people don't do. They may not even think of the potential applications when they start their research. So this is one of the reasons why we've not built, and it will be built over a long period of time. Probably another 10 years, I think things will change.
Let's go into one of the questions in the book. There is this constant conflict between scientists and bureaucrats. Success in other parts of the world is when learning or educational institutions have been able to move away from government and be able to privatize. You have talked extensively in the book about the conflicts, and you did talk about the misunderstanding of the political class in terms of how science should be developed. Having said that, how can we privatize science in India?
So I didn't say misunderstanding, a lack of understanding of what science is,
right.
By everybody, not just politics.
Right.
Politicians.
How can science become private?
So I don't know whether privatization is the answer. We do need a lot of privatization, but government has not given up its role in any of the countries that we've seen as flourish. U.S. government is the biggest spender. Some of the big universities that you have in the U.S. are public universities. UC system is public. UC Berkeley is among the top 10 universities of the world. At least some ranking systems. And you have many other private public universities, in many states in America, which are exceptional.
True, but do you know where the funding goes into? Which buckets of expenditure?
Yeah, they have autonomy in the first place, and they work in a very different way from India. But having said that, all of them get private funding also, you have endowments of 10 billion, 20 billion. Even the small university will have several $100 million of endowments. So people do support science, rich people. That trend has begun only very recently. The big businessmen had been around for 100 years, probably more. Even in the 19th century, they have very wealthy businessmen who used to do philanthropic funding. But in India, this sort of wealth is relatively recent, probably a few decades. And we have seen Chris Gopalakrishnan, one example, funding science. Narayana Murthy also does some funding, which he does not make public, but he has given a lot of money. Others have not followed, probably because some philanthropists in India feel that their role is not to fund science and technology. There is a much bigger problem, which is primary education, and so there is a lot of money going into primary education. Education in general. Premji is one example. He decided to put all his money in education. So again, we come back to the point that we discussed. We do not know what science means to India, and we have not figured it out. 30 years from now, if Indian economy wants to grow, where do we put our money? What sector? We have limited resources. How much of that do we put in science? Similarly, once we know that, philanthropists will also know, okay, this is an important sector, I should support it. At the moment, there is no understanding other than a few very enlightened individuals, which has come because they have themselves studied science. In China, most of the leaders have studied science and engineering.
Right.
If you look at the Politburo, including Xi Jinping, he is an engineer.
Right.
Indians in India, the bureaucracy and the political class do not come from a background in science, and neither do many of the businessmen.
Right. We talk about a history of 500 years of science and technology development around the world, the modern science and technology.
Yeah.
If we want to go through history, the Indus Valley civilization, the Mesopotamian civilizations, and these civilizations also did not survive without science. In fact, they survived with a lot of science and their own technologies. Okay. But if you look at one glaring difference between the terminologies, the modern science uses the terminology of research, and these ancient civilizations use the terminology of inquiry. Both are required, but given the advancement in artificial intelligence, neural computing, we can do it a lot better and a lot faster. We don't need humans to do it. Whereas inquiry is not something that technology can actually do, which humans can. Where do you see this new approach developing to science and technology?
So if you look at my book, although it is a book about science, if you read it, you'll realize a lot of it is engineering.
Right.
And the scientists themselves do the engineering. The favorite example is Govind Swarup.
Yes.
He was a physicist. He studied physics and then studied astronomy. In Stanford, he built a telescope. It was sort of routine. When you want to do a problem that has not been done before, it is very likely that you may need an equipment which has not been built before. So scientists themselves build that. So when he came here, the situation is a bit different. Nobody had even seen a radio telescope. He was the only one in the country who had seen a radio telescope and worked on a radio telescope. He gathered a team. I think over a period of time, it was about 25 or so. And he built this big telescope at Ooty, and then later the telescope near Pune, GMRT. In this process, he dropped his science, which is a bigger sacrifice. I wanted to come to that point earlier. These people made sacrifices. Generally, 100 years from now, international community of astronomers will remember his papers, Govind Swarup's papers, but they may not remember that he built a telescope in India. So for scientists, publishing papers, creating new knowledge is important. That is how they build their legacy. But he had to drop his science because he had no time. He had to build these two telescopes. So there was a sacrifice involved. So at the moment, building equipment is not considered as a big part of science. It is again cultural, and people win Nobel Prizes for building equipment. Cryo electron microscope, which is now the best tool in biology. Richard Henderson built over decades, and he won a Nobel Prize for it. I cannot imagine anybody working on building such a complicated equipment. I mean, even for UK, he's special, but otherwise, we don't build anything, and I think it's a tradition. that we have to change, like cultural tradition. That technology and science are the same. The famous report by Vannevar Bush, which became a policy document for the US during and after the war, it talks about science, the endless frontier, where he creates two distinctions between science and technology. Create knowledge, and the knowledge comes and builds technology. And he talks about science more than 100 times in the document, very little about technology. This is an artificial distinction, and now when we read it, we realize that he had overstated the case. It became a very famous document and influenced policy around the world, but it's actually wrong. That is not the way science is done, and it's technology and science in many cases is part of the same thing, and it's only in our mind that they're different.
The technology that we build needs to be informed by science. We are in an agile world today where there is no distinction that, I will wear the hat of a scientist and you wear the hat of a engineer, and let's bring some things together. If that happens, it's great. But when that doesn't happen, at least at a conceptualization stage, you need to be both, because you're just building prototypes. How do we give that importance to conceptualization, which is nothing but modeling, creating forms out of abstract? For example, if I would say that Shastra, I want the Shastra to be read by the 8th graders, 6th graders, 7th graders more than the IIT engineers, because they get a very new perspective, a perspective that they don't get in their classrooms.
Yeah.
How can you make this available?
So ultimately, science is not something that we can pick and choose, because science, since we don't understand what we need to do, precisely we need to do, the only way to do it is to do everything, at least a little bit of everything. And you cannot have missing pieces. India is a poor country, so we cannot afford to do astronomy, expensive astronomy or expensive particle physics. So we will not do those things. We will do things that are required for the poor people to have water for the future, to have food, and to healthcare. The problem is a lot of the technology that we require in healthcare for the poor people can come out of a particle accelerator, and it has. CERN has produced so many technologies that everybody uses, including the internet, and it continues to do that now. So we know that we have to do science everywhere, including all the things that you talked about, but we don't do. Coming to Shastra, this is not really, although it is coming out of an IIT, in my mind at least, it is meant for the public. It's not meant for IIT professors or IIT students. They will read it, and we are happy that if they read it. But the primary target is the world outside the IITs, outside the universities. The way it is written now probably may not be okay for a school. Definitely not for 8th or 9th grade, at least a substantial part of the magazine. Beginning and end, some parts kids can probably understand. At some point in the future, when we stabilize, we will have a kids version. Well, I won't say kids version, a high school version, that they can understand. And if we do well, there can be many varieties of Shastra. Not just one product for everybody.
Right. When we talk about education in the modern digital parlance, it is content. It can get delivered in a classroom, it can get delivered at home, it can get delivered anywhere, contextually. That is the power of digital. And when I talk about digitalization, that is what I mean, not simply making it available online.
Let me say something that is relevant here. First of all, when we build, make Shastra, produce Shastra, in my mind, it should be understood by anybody from 11th standard onwards. So if you have if you finish 10th standard and you have basic understanding of science till 10th standard, you can understand Shastra. But below 10th standard, and 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th, I'm not sure. There are probably many articles that can be understood by them. But that you mentioned about food, science as a national movement is what we wanted to do. I don't know how, 5 years or 10 years from now, how many people would read a science magazine, let alone Shastra. I'm sure many will do. Still, you may not cover more than a few percent of the national population of that age. Science has not become a tool for decision making for an individual. So there are so many things that we do because our parents have done it, their parents have done it, our society does it, but which is not good for us, even if it's part of our culture. So now it is well known that carbohydrates are not good for you, especially refined carbohydrates. If you eat a lot, sugar is not good for you. But even if you know it, it is very difficult to make that transition. I suppose you can do that if you start at a very early age, when it has not become a habit. Science as a decision-making tool is one of our objectives. Science as a business tool as a second. So these are two of main objectives of Shastra.
There are many characters in your book who have come from the remotest parts of the country and have come into urban cities in order for them to become successful at what they did. But India is still 70% a rural country. There is tremendous amount of curious minds, and these curious minds can be shaped. What is lacking in our imaginations? You can think in any language. You can think under any circumstances. A person can simply look at the sky and think about astronomy. All one needs is the right kind of data and content.
Yeah. But it's hard to provide that content. This is one of the problems. We say that we have to learn in our own language. I know if you take my own language, which is Malayalam, I made the switch in 5th standard from Malayalam to English. I learned the English script in 4th standard, probably 3rd standard. And when I was in 4th standard, I did not know more than about 10 or 15 English words. But in 5th standard, I switched to English medium. And the switch was quite seamless. It was not difficult at all. I think I made a wise decision because within a few years, I realized the number of books I could read about science and things in the world, which was not available in Malayalam. And I'm sure this is the case in all languages. Probably, I'm not sure of Hindi. There are more books published in English at the cutting edge and than in other languages that is accessible from India. Maybe there is a German, every book is translated into German or Japanese or Chinese, but I don't think they are available in Indian languages. And if you look at the best journals in the world, they are available in English. If you do not read English, it is very difficult to access them. You can teach them in their own languages, yes, but at some point they'll have to make a transition, and the sooner you make a transition, the better it is for them. This is an unfortunate fact. Maybe technology 10 years from now will remove that barrier. It should. Everything is available, is naturally translated into all the languages of the world. That will be a wonderful time. But at the moment, even if you don't think in English, you can think in any language, but the material that you need to read is not available in your language.
Today, if you implement a digital tool of natural language processing and a computer vision, you can convert any audio, video, graphics or text from any language into any language in a few seconds. Mm-hmm. You and I, we grew up at a time when if we needed a book to be reprinted in another language, they needed to have X amount of mass to produce that.
Yeah.
Digital takes away that limitation.
Yeah, but there is still a human being needs to translate it. We have been trying to translate Shastra, for example. We have not been able to do it to our satisfaction.
True. You have to train neurally for a very, very long time. But there are tools today that have completely advanced. And you're right. You cannot just arrive at it and say, I want to tomorrow morning transform Shastra from an English lingual to any lingual in the world. You need to train. And that is where the equipment come in. That is where the technology comes in. This is where the investment comes in. This is the future direction. But you can always start with small experiments. You don't have to produce an entire journal, but you can, like you said, you can take some parts and convert them into digital and make them available digitally.
Yeah, yeah. Even human translation we found difficult because it's quite technical, right? Some of the stories when we translated they become very dense, far more dense in the native language than it was in English.
Right. So the idea is that English and human communication is not going to go away. For example, like you said, you made that choice at the 5th grade and you made the transition from your native language to a foreign language. You probably come from a background that supports education, but we are talking about where the parent is not even allowing the child to go to school.
Yeah.
Even for this person to be able to move from the position of what is a language and how do I process it for either for communication or for computing in my mind, and how do I become equal, this has to go to a rural school. This has to become part of the narrative of how we do it.
Yeah. So one example of this is how something is done very well is a foundation called Agastya Foundation.
Yes, I've heard of.
Yeah. So it's there in rural Andhra Pradesh near Kuppam, and they go to schools like this where I have been to some of those schools where the children come without a meal and they get their first meal at noon, their lunch, and some days they give breakfast, and on those days when they give breakfast there's more children come and they are able to attend focus in the class much more. So then I realized the problem is far more basic than we imagine.
Right.
First we have to give them food. The children don't have food even now. Even the poorest of urban kids will have food, but they don't. And they are all people who work on farms. The parents go in the morning, but the children go to school or not. It is not something that they're that worried about. And
right.
They think that school will give them food. So
how do you see the transition in the future to writing a sequel to Space Life matter, or the future of Shastra?
Shastra, we hope will expand over next year. We want to increase the frequency first from a bi-monthly to a monthly. And then slowly as we build, we will have lots of things around Shastra. But the problem for me, for anybody who's building something is we don't have the experience. This is the first time a magazine is being done like this. So we have to create that experience as we go along, and that's a slow process. We have to train people. You cannot just hire 20 people and build a magazine.
Right.
They're not available because the skill is not there. So we have a dichotomy of those. We have exceptional journalists. I can hire 10 or 15 tomorrow if I have the money, but they have not done in science. They're not experienced in science. If I hire a PhD, they do not have the skills to practice journalism.
Right.
So this dichotomy we have to bridge over a period of time. That's our biggest challenge. And I think it's much easier for me to train people to write. Although writing is not easy at all. Even for the best writers, writing is not easy. Than teach science at an advanced level to somebody who has not studied science. There is a severe mental block. At least in writing there is no mental block. It is not this much. So I hope we have a reasonable pool of writers with a background in science over the next 3 years. If we manage to do that, then we can go to the next stage, expand and do lots of things that have not been done before. That's the thing. And about a book, I'm indeed working on a book, but it's not related to the Space Life matter at all. It's not even related to India.
Okay.
And I'm very early stages. But I do feel that I have only touched the surface. I'm interested in figuring out how science began in India. In the 1870s, once university system started in formal terms in India, we set up Bombay, Calcutta and Madras universities. In a few decades, science became an important activity. We have mathematics being done at an international level in the way European mathematics is done, not the traditional Indian mathematics, in the symbolic language that we used to now. And then by the 1890s, Indians started publishing. Well, Indian had been publishing papers even before, but this became very, very prominent by the 1890s. And then you had an explosion after that. Big, fantastic mathematicians. Ramanujan is known, but Ramanujam is known. But there were many other mathematicians who are, some of whom we have covered in Shastra in this issue. And then you have three, potential Nobel Prize winners, one of which actually won it in the 20s. And this is an amazing journey, And Indians took to science like, fish to water, as they say, is a cliche. I find this very fascinating. I want to look at this at some point. I don't know how I will do. And I continue to be fascinated by the fact, what we discussed before. Why should we do science at all? What is the place for science in a poor country? I don't know. I haven't understood. And for that, there is no primary data that I can look at, and I will have to do interviews across the spectrum. If I get time, I will look at that project at some point.
You have written extensively about this generation, 1920 until almost the current stage. Many of the protagonists of your scientific journey are still alive. They operate in the current world today. Mm-hmm. There is a very distinct intellectual integrity about these scientists that you speak about. And their narratives are somehow not colored by commercialism. They wanted to earn money, they wanted to earn fame, which is a very natural human instinct. You also come across scientists and engineers and technologists today. In your journalistic life, you must have come across quite a few of them. How do you compare that intellectual integrity?
It's hard to figure out because what we see about the past is a very distilled past. I have not lived through 1950s and 60s and 70s and talked to every scientist who was doing at that time. We spoke only to people who rose above the rest, and they obviously has very high intellectual integrity. Whether everybody had that intellectual integrity at that time, I don't know. I must have spoken to about 20 to 30 scientists from that era, the first 3 decades, while I would have spoken to about 1,000 who are working now. This is not a sample that you can compare with each other. But having said that, I have not really met people who did not have intellectual integrity that many times. Of course, our conversations are all very, very immediate, and we spend an hour or 2 hours through a career, maybe meet them a few times, most of them. And we generally talk about work. And the deeper issues about how they did, what they did, is not known to me. But having said that, I have not seen anything suspicious that somebody did something wrong. Of course, there are jealousies. Human nature we cannot change, right? I mean, there are professional jealousies. There, people try to do better than the others, and sometimes they try to put down others. Intellectual integrity is something different.
Let me clarify what I mean by intellectual integrity. It's a very specific definition. Irrespective of the consequences, you do the right thing.
Yeah.
To me, that is the definition of intellectual integrity.
Aspect of a scientific life that comes out clearly. This is not about commercializing anything. It's about publishing a paper. When you're publishing a paper, whose name do you put as an author? Do you put your name on a student paper where a student did everything just because it is your student? In the book, I have mentioned this, but not in great detail. There is an example of Sharma, who refused to put his name in a student paper unless he himself actually contributed through ideas or actual work. And he did it because his own professor in Cambridge did not do that. And he passed on that habit to, and Sharma anyway was a person of very high integrity. This is often quoted example of Mashilkar, who is his student, published his first paper, Mashilkar, Sharma, R.M. Mashilkar. Next one was R.M. Mashilkar, M.M. Sharma, and third one is R.M. Mashilkar alone. Sharma did not put his name. And if you look at his CV, there is a long list of, at the end of his own achievements, there is a list of papers there where his students published, where he did not contribute. That's a special category available only to him. Not many scientists. I don't know of any scientist who has something like that. Maybe there is. This is unique. I know of several scientists in the country who do not follow that example, who did not, through this period that I've written, they put their name on every paper that the student published. And that sort of integrity they did not have. At least a large number of them did not have. Some of them had. I think it is not so common now, but I'm not sure.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Subha.
Science is at a critical fork on our planet. It has the potential to leap forward exponentially. First, the science deniers have to be confronted and persuaded to be reasonable with their arguments. Second, the approach of science must be an integrated one, starting early at the age segments of 8 to 18 and 18 to 25. Thirdly, learning mechanisms must inform the advancement, precisely making progress from innocence to awareness, to understanding, to definition, to competence and excellence. Indian educational institutions must show a great rigor to attract funding through grants and endowments that universities and research institutions manage to attract overseas. Simply put, there must be a better way of finding expression to a business case for their research. Data science cannot be viewed as an exclusive domain anymore. Everyone is a data scientist in their own right and need to at least make sense of their data at their individual and local level. There is an absolute need to connect the creation to connection of data through digital in every sphere of life. We thank Hari Pulakat for investing time to feature in this episode. In the next episode, we feature the topic of the age of creators economy through the lens of young startup entrepreneur Azan Feroz Said, who is the founder and calls himself the Chief Happiness Officer at the Hub, Bangalore. Please participate by subscribing to any of your favorite channels that you use and write your ideas and perspectives to fow@giggr.app. See you on the other side live. #Tuesdays at 5 in the next episode.